this has finally got somebody to go on the record to push back. Um, the Pentagon impacts a lot of jobs, impacts a lot of congressional districts. Um, the military industrial complex exists in our country. There are probably 400 out of 435 congressional districts that have some part of their economy that's propped up by the defense industry. Okay. So it's a very, and so if anything is going to rile up elected Republicans, you would think it would be defense cuts.
It is just 60 days since Donald Trump returned to the White House, and his administration, of course, has been moving at breakneck speed on so many issues. So, who better to help us make sense of it all than one of America's most respected political analysts, the former moderator of NBC's Meet the Press? He's been covering politics since 1992. He's the host of the brilliant Chuck Toddcast, and we always appreciate his time. It is the great Chuck Todd. Chuck, welcome back to Times Radio.
Thank you, James. Great to be here. Love what you guys are doing.
I wanted to start by asking you how you think the opening few weeks of the second Trump presidency compare to the beginning of the first Trump presidency.
Well, it's night and day, right? When you think about now, I think back to the first Trump presidency, and I think in hindsight, a lot more credit should be given to two people for creating an administration filled with, what I would say are people that sort of had what I would call America's historical best interest at heart. And that's Mike Pence and Reince Priebus. Reince Priebus was the chief of staff, and Mike Pence was the vice president. The two of them ran the transition. The two of them is who got people like John Kelly into the cabinet, Jim Mattis into the cabinet, Rex Tillerson into the cabinet. And so these weren't, Donald Trump was new to politics at the time. He didn't come in with his own people. He had like a couple of people, right? Steve Mnuchin at Treasury. But for the most part, he needed help, right? He needed the party to fill in the gaps. And those people restrained Trump instinct on some of this stuff, restrained him on tariffs, restrained him on his views about NATO, and in hindsight now you saw it. Well, guess who else saw it? Donald Trump, right? And for Trump 2.0, there are no outsiders. There's no Mike Pence. There's no Reince Priebus. I mean, perhaps the most establishment Republican that's in the circle there is Marco Rubio.
Mm.
And he's been it's the weakest Secretary of State we've seen, sort of perhaps, really not since the first Secretary of State of Nixon when before Kissinger took both jobs, right? National Security Advisor and that was a pretty weak Secretary of State. And this one, Marco Rubio is essentially just a spokesperson, right? He does not have any influence on policy. He is not there to debate
Well,
foreign
you could
policy.
see it on the sofa in the Oval Office when they had
100%.
Zelensky. It was all about
Right.
J.D. Vance and Trump.
So that's the biggest, when people just say, what's the biggest? It's like Trump came in here and decided, and he brought in his people and he recruited people that have always wanted to get their hands on some of this stuff and wanted to essentially rip out some government programs by the roots. Um, and he has really aligned himself with this sort of radical transformers inside the conservative movement, some of whom don't necessarily see eye to eye with Trump on some things, but because they want to dismantle what they argue is dismantle the administrative state, which they believe is prevented their version of conservatism from taking hold. And so the idea is if you can gut it all, even if you don't successfully say get rid of the Department of Education, but you so gut it that it doesn't really have any abilities with it, then even when it gets rebuilt by a new administration, it will be done leaner. It will be done with maybe um, less political ideology. So it's in that sense, it is, Donald Trump learned a lot of lessons, and he decided that he was going to use those lessons to do it his way, period. And he really wants retribution. And it is pretty clear he is not interested in any high road. I mean, he wants to just, he believes there was a systematic attempt, and he's not wrong. uh, to try to keep anybody that was close to Trump from being able to get a job after he got out of office, keep them off of corporate boards, prevent them from getting speaking fees, prevent them from being able to be a part of quote unquote polite political society. And Trump has decided he wants now to do what he believes was done to his side. He's going to do this now to the left. So he's going after law firms. He's going after legacy media. He is going after the Kennedy Center, right? Going after the arts. This is, this really is more of a cultural revolution that we're all experiencing here, almost more so than any policy revolution, if you will.
I wanted to ask you about the economy because, of course, he campaigned on improving the American economy. He said it would get better under
Hmm.
him on day one. And things aren't going particularly well on that front. The NASDAQ and the Dow Jones have really suffered in recent
Right.
weeks. Inflation, there are worries that's going to spike up. People are very concerned about trade wars with your closest
Right.
allies. Is the economy Trump's Achilles heel?
I think it is because, it's funny. What makes Trump, I think, attractive to some people is that he has no ideology except on one thing: tariffs.
And why is that?
He's
Because
believed it.
it doesn't make any
It's
sense to me that he should surely be a free marketeer.
he is it's it he's never been a free marketeer. That's the irony here. He thought Japan was eating America's lunch in the 80s. There's this famous, the first political advertisement he ever paid for was a newspaper ad in the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal in like 1987 that says, "Hey, our political leaders are chumps. Japan's eating their lunch," that sort of thing, which made him sound like a left winger at the time. It was actually the Democratic mainstream wing of the Democratic Party was sort of echoing that. And so, and what's been interesting is protectionism has always been and more associated, at least in my lifetime, with the left than it has been with the right, because the idea the right's always been the home of the free marketeers, and the left has been, sort of
Mm.
on trying to restrain some of this, protect work, always under the guise of protecting workers' rights or protecting um, American jobs. And so it is the one ideology, and here's the problem with Trump's theory of the case. Whether let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe if you could go back into time and never sign all these global free trade agreements that we have been signing and encouraging for the last 30 years, okay? Maybe we would have a different manufacturing, base here in America that would still be thriving. Okay, maybe that's true. But that isn't how we built our economy over the last 30 years. We built it. Every American corporation is a multi-international corporation. That's the point, right? And trying to essentially re-engineer the economy after it's been this mature globally. I mean, it's not just that we're going to hurt our economy. We're going to hurt every economy around the world because we are, as we try, as corporations try to retreat from overseas investments, right? That's going to be a trigger. Then you throw in tariffs, which are just taxes on consumers, both on this side of the ocean and on your side of the ocean. No, and this is where I think the whole thing comes undone for him. And I think some of us, I thought the stock market was going to be a guardrail. It is not. I think he is going to go. I think he will drive off the cliff campaigning for tariffs. I think it's the one
It's the
thing
hill
he
he's prepared to
believes in.
die on.
It's the hill he'll die on. And I think we're going to have this is going to be a rough period for the stock market. That's for sure.
Do you think it maybe goes back to his personality and the influence decades ago of whether it was his father Fred Trump, whether it was Roy Cohn, this sense that he sees everything through a prism of you're either a winner or you're a loser. And so he
Yeah.
sees trade deals in that sense. The idea that you could have free trade and it would be mutually beneficial for different partners. He
Yeah.
thinks, well, the world doesn't work that way.
Everything is binary to him,
Yeah.
right? You're absolutely right. Winners or losers, period. And you know, it is interesting that he is now, because people have informed him, hey, you historically align with these former Republicans of the past, William McKinley, and William Howard Taft. Look, the Republicans pre-FDR were all protectionists. And in fact, the nationalist wing of the Republican Party, the last time it was this powerful inside the Republican Party was in the 1920s and 30s. And what was the trigger then? The trigger was immigration and nativism. And that's when we put a lot of immigration quotas on the books. The most, when you go and tour Ellis Island, which where many immigrants came to in New York City, and you see these horrible things that immigrants were called as they were coming in, that all happened in the 1920s, right? That was we were look, you guys have experienced, all Europe's experienced it. Right? The migrant crisis has sort of brought out xenophobia all over the world. This has been, I always say, America's southern border is no different than the Mediterranean Sea in Europe,
Yeah.
right? It's the same issues, just different border that migrants are crossing. And so yes, I think he has stumbled into that ideology, right? Just because of his core belief. And then of course, what makes tariffs even more enticing to him politically is how much power it gives him personally. Companies literally have to come to the Oval Office and beg to be taken off, given an exemption on tariffs. And so what does that mean? He's in charge. He decides. He's picking the winners and losers. Tim Cook of Apple comes in and makes nice with Trump. Okay, I'll lower your tariffs so that you can keep making your iPhones for cheap in China, right? But if you don't, if you're Ford Motor Company and you say, hey, this is good, yeah, good luck with your that free trade agreement we had with Canada, and all the tariffs that are going to go back and forth on American-made cars. I mean, the idea that because of this bizarre fight he's picking with Canada and Mexico,
Mm.
that basically what most Americans consider American made, where some parts do come, or, we created a free trade zone here between the three countries in our continent, um, it's going to get tariffed. And these massive amount of taxes on it. So I do think there's another North Star here, James, that people aren't fully realizing is I think he mistakenly believes that tariffs can replace all tax revenue, and that we will, there's a movement here to move to a consumption tax, and it's always been in the right. They want to abolish the income tax, and in exchange substitute it for a consumption tax, of that, however you want to call it. And I think that is another long-term goal here. If Trump is successful, and I just don't think he will be, just tariffs don't work the way he thinks they work. This idea that we're collecting the money from other countries, I mean, it really is among, I mean, you're just like, did he miss school on the day they taught economics at Wharton? I mean, I can't imagine any business school in America who would have taught uh, students that tariffs are paid for by other people and not by consumers.
Here's a theory for you, Chuck. If he does drive the US economy off a cliff because of his insistence of sticking with his tariff
Mhm.
policy, he's going to need a scapegoat. He's going to need someone he can blame it on.
Mhm.
Why is the economy not doing better? At the moment, he's still blaming Biden, but you can only do that for so long.
Right.
Obviously, everyone in Washington speculates on if and when he's going to fall out with Elon Musk. But I think for the time being, he's too useful
Yeah.
a lightning rod for the administration's critics. He's useful to have there.
100%.
Scott Bessent,
Yep.
the Treasury Secretary, if you get rid of him, well, that raises questions about Trump's judgment because he was a Trump appointee. I think he will
Mhm.
blame the Fed. I think he'll go
Yeah.
after Jerome Powell because even though he was a Trump appointee in
I
2018,
was just going to say, and the narrator is going to jump in here and say, he was a Trump
he was a Trump
appointee.
appointee, but he will be able to
But
say
but he
he's
wasn't,
in the swamp.
but he was an appointee that people around Trump told him he should make. I
Exactly.
mean, it is true in that Jay Powell was somebody they were like, oh, Jesus, he's going to pick the next Fed chair. Let's feed him Jay Powell.
Yeah.
Let's make sure he knows it should be Jay Powell. So 100%. There's no doubt he's already setting it up. He, I think, tweeted overnight that, hey, he thought that the Fed should be raising. Well, the Fed may have to lower interest rates because he's going to crater the economy with these tariffs. So, but um, I think he thinks that if the Fed can lower interest rates, it can cushion the blow on tariffs. I don't think it will, but he seems to think that. I think you're right. He will scapegoat him, but I don't know how much people are going to buy that. I really do. I mean, I know he's really good at scapegoating, but I mean, the fact is, this economy was healing. We were a healing economy. He was handed a healing economy, and he literally has picked every scab, picked every single scab, and now we're bleeding again.
I mentioned the Musk thing. I mean, everyone's got a theory on how long they will continue as allies. It is an unlikely bromance. How
Right.
long do you give it?
Longer than people realize, because there's one thing about Donald Trump you have to remember is that he thinks if he the only people he respects are people that are wealthier than he is, and Musk is wealthier than he is. So he equates wealth with IQ because he wants people to equate his wealth with IQ, right? You project on other people what you want people to project onto you. So I do think, and Musk is he's literally bought Trump's love. Okay. He has literally bought Trump's love. He finances the entire political operation, and it has become a pretty, it'll be really interesting if Musk pulls off we have a test, sort of an early election in Wisconsin that's coming up in about a week Wisconsin's one of these states that elects their state Supreme Court judges, which I think is just a terrible thing to do. But regardless, Wisconsin has decided that the rule of law should be put on the ballot, which I think is a scary thing when you do that. But Musk is now the biggest donor to the conservative justice that's running versus the liberal justice. And it's a bellwether type of race. And it's a real test. Okay, Republicans in the Trump era lose a lot of races when Trump's not on the ballot. And that's going to be an interesting test. But I think Musk is going to be a lot harder to dislodge from Trump than conventional wisdom believes. Look, we thought the stock market was going to be a guardrail, and it wasn't. And I'd be careful of folks just assuming that, I I think if the relationship breaks up, it's because Musk leaves frustrated. I don't think it's Trump kicks him out.
Is Trump afraid of Musk? The fact that he has the wealth that he has, the fact that he has X.
He's afraid of rich people,
Yeah.
people that are wealthier than he is. Which is why it's funny to me when people like Jeff Bezos kowtow to him, because actually don't think you have to. He's one of the few people that, but he has decided that because the space program, if you're invested in that, you have to have good relationships with government. You can't really build a space company privately. You have to have government. And it was pretty clear since Elon Musk, and look, Elon Musk is never, the reason why I don't think it's leaving anytime soon is Musk needs the government to accomplish his goal of getting to Mars, period. So, the only thing Trump should fear with Musk is if Musk decides Trump's no longer useful and he moves to, maybe it's helping Vance, or he moves to help somebody else, right? Because Musk has one goal in mind, right? Whatever it takes to let him run our space program, for better or for worse. And the only way he does that is if he has access and to to whoever the president is. And he just bought this kind of access to him. So no, and he is, again, I go back to only the wealthy are the ones that Trump fears. So I do think there's probably a little fear of Musk. He wouldn't want to lose his support. That would bother him.
I wanted to ask you, Chuck, about the Trump administration's approach to Ukraine, because certainly that's been making a lot of news on this side of the
Hmm.
Atlantic. The perception that a lot of Brits have is that America has effectively switched sides, that essentially Trump is now on Russia's side. Is that how it's seen in the US?
Yeah, well, it depends on your point. It depends where you stand. It certainly looks like America switched sides to any foreign policy analyst, because here it's one thing to be itching for peace. It's another thing to literally deny an ally operational intelligence in order to save lives, right? And when Trump did that, that was to me the most chilling. And that was the moment where you realized, oh my God, our alliances are destroyed for 50 years. This is going to take multiple American elections to prove to Europeans that we can be trusted again. Um, and I mean, and we are now going to have 50 nations with nuclear weapons in the next 20 years. I mean, just just this is going to be one of the great mistakes in modern history. Um, but look, there's two ways to look at Trump with Ukraine. There's the conspiracy angle, which is he's on the payroll. that somehow he's doing Putin's bidding because Putin has something on him. There's also the simple fact that Trump just may respect Putin more than he respects smaller countries. And I mean this about all small. I think I think Trump only respects two other leaders in the world, Xi and Putin, because he again, it goes back to the you're either everything's binary. You're strong, you're weak. You're big, you're small. You're rich, you're poor, right? There's no developing. We're not here to develop. Throw in how Trump personalizes everything. Trump blames Ukraine for his political problems, which turned into personal legal problems. So even if America's interests are not well served by abandoning Ukraine, Donald Trump's interests come before America's interest in this case. And he is angry at Ukraine. He blames Zelensky. You know, he basically believes that Ukraine was on the side of the Democrats. JD Vance sort of spilled those beans during that dust up with Zelensky when he said you were campaigning in Pennsylvania. He went to a factory to thank people for war munitions, right? But if you wanted to choose to believe that was a strategic decision to support Kamala Harris, well, then you're just looking to be outraged, right? And there was no doubt they were looking to be outraged. But I actually think that Trump isn't sort of on the Putin payroll. I think it's simply like it's much simpler than that. He respects Putin, fears him a little bit, doesn't respect Zelensky, doesn't fear and views it this way. Canada should be America's. Why shouldn't Ukraine belong to Russia? That's not our business. Canada would be our business, right? I think, views it almost the way, if you want to stereotype, mob bosses believe they have turf, right? This is my turf. I think Trump views Ukraine as Russia's turf. Hey, that's their neighborhood. And, I don't, this isn't going to get better. The question is, how much does Ukraine have to capitulate in order not to be pulverized by what's left of the Russian army?
Do you think he's also overestimated how easy it is to get a peace deal? I mean, we had this call between Putin and Trump earlier this
Yes.
week. And this is the man who boasted he could end the war in Ukraine within a day of
Yeah.
taking office. He's not even going to do it in his
Yeah.
first 100 days. Even if he gets a ceasefire deal, that is very different to then a
Yeah.
lasting peace deal. And I wonder, actually, if Ukraine's best hope at this moment is to try and persuade the Europeans to double down in their support and hope that Trump just gets bored of the Ukraine issue and moves on to something else.
I think buying time is the best strat. If I were Zelensky, I would see if Europe, how could Europe fill the gaps? Um, I think you're gonna, it's inevitable now that, we see Germany's gonna set themselves up to borrow money in order to invest in defense. We see the EU's starting to think that way. We've already seen what the UK has been willing to do. Um, if I were Zelensky, I would be essentially giving up on the Americans without saying it yet and doing what you just described, seeing if he can get 70% of what he was getting from America, from Europe, and from some other allies, and buy time. Because here's one thing we know: Russia wasn't succeeding. This was a stalemate. There's no doubt this was being fought to a stalemate. And can it stay a stalemate without American support? I think here's what I would say is I never underestimate a group of people that are fighting to stay in their own homes versus invaders. I will always take the invaded over the invader because the invaded doesn't have any, they got nothing to lose and they will fight to the bitter end. The invader has somewhere else to be. The invader has somewhere else to go. The invader eventually can run out of money, can run out of assets. And, you know, it I think Ukraine was turning into another Afghanistan for Russia. And unfortunately, Trump basically gave Putin a bunch of relief. I mean, it was continuing to incrementally get there, where this was very painful, and that was the whole point. In fact, it's been so painful. that I think she is not going to try to take Taiwan by force. I think he has watched this and realized, you try to take something by force, you're better off making a business deal with Taiwan. You're better. They could have made business deals with Ukraine, and they'd have been better and kept Ukraine more out of NATO. They'd have had a better than all the munitions and lives that they've lost in Russia. But at this point, Putin, Putin, that's something else. The way Trump feels about tariffs is the way Putin feels about
Yes.
rebuilding the Soviet Union.
Well,
So,
this is the thing. I mean, we've spoken before, Chuck, about how the Republican Party of old is dead, really, and it is Donald Trump's party now.
mhm,
But ever since the days of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union and the Russians have had two major aims: end NATO, or break up NATO, or certainly weaken NATO, and weaken the
mhm,
transatlantic alliance. And the man who's
mhm.
now delivering on those is the US president. And I wonder if there are not at least some Republicans still who are deeply unsettled by that.
So we got our first public pushback overnight. The Republican heads of the two armed services committees in the Senate and the House put out a joint statement pushing back on the idea that the Pentagon had floated the trial balloon that America would pull troops out of various spots in Europe, pull back on it, even no longer have an American general in charge of NATO. I mean, an institution that basically, arguably, we, we, we built, we funded. This is, I mean, the reason it's always an American general is because who else would you put in charge of it at the time, right? Given all the resources that we had contributed to the alliance and how important our security umbrella, more so than anybody else's, because of our nuclear weapons and stuff, contributed this alliance. So to just to see it, to not even have an American in charge of that, that apparently was enough to get these guys to put their name on a piece of paper. We get a lot of anonymous Republicans who tell us this is terrible. Rarely do you see them put their name to the criticism. And these two, so it could, I don't think there's any issue that breaks the party up anymore. Okay. Trump is too dominant. Um, but I do think this is the fact that this has finally got somebody to go on the record to push back. Um, the Pentagon impacts a lot of jobs, impacts a lot of congressional districts. Um, the military industrial complex exists in our country. There are probably 400 out of 435 congressional districts that have some part of their economy that's propped up by the defense industry. Okay. So it's a very, and so if anything is going to rile up elected Republicans, you would think it would be defense cuts. And this is so I'm not making any promises that this is going to grow, but you were asking, this is the first public pushback we've seen.
What about the Democrats? How should they respond to what Trump is doing? Because there seems to be this. Obviously, they're in disarray on one level after the defeat in
Right.
November. But you had people like James
Right.
Carville come out and say, essentially, we need to just sit back, don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. We should just watch the car crash unfold. And others who say, no, we
Mhm.
need to be far more proactive in crafting a criticism. What do you think is the right response for the Democrats?
Well, the Democrats are trapped by their own um, messaging, meaning they've been making the case they're the responsible party. They're the grown-ups. They're the ones that don't shut down government. They're the ones that tell you how to operate correctly on COVID. They're the ones, right? They're all these, and so to suddenly be in the minority and act irresponsibly is just not who they are, right? And I actually think so. If they had gone ahead and said, screw it, we're not going to help them keep the government open, let them shut down the government, let them, the Democrats would have owned that, right? It was a choice that they were going to do, and I understand. Look, I get it. Emotion, people are just emotionally worn out from the way Trump has run roughshod over the government. And there's this anger at Elon Musk for all those reasons. So I understand the emotional reaction. Um, but the problem the Democrats have right now, I think, is they're leaderless. Um, and the leaders that are in place in their technical leadership um, is while Hakeem Jeffries is on the ascent, Chuck Schumer's day, he's closer to retirement than he is uh, uh, to being sort of at the peak of his political career. Um, but he's a career politician. He doesn't know what else to do, right? And it's one of those things. I think he fears that if he walks away, he has nothing to live for. I wish some of these members of Congress would get a hobby or something. Go get some grandkids. Go learn how to. You know, I do think that they do need a different type of leadership, but um, they are largely powerless right now. And I think the problem Schumer made was he overpromised and then, of course, underdelivered.
Mm,
Making this case that they somehow were going to be able to stop Trump from doing stuff. Look, House Republicans were more united than the Democrats expected. And had they not been united and they couldn't pass that initial budget, then the Senate wouldn't have mattered. But Donald Trump's control of this party is impressive. He got a bunch of Republicans who never like to vote for this stuff to vote for it, and it took away all the leverage Democrats had. They had no more leverage, and even though but Schumer created the illusion for 24 hours that they did. So then when he surrendered, when he realized, oh, we don't have any leverage here, he had to admit that. I mean, he made the right decision, I think, because it would have been much worse. If they orchestrated the shutdown, then Donald Trump could start blaming Democrats for a bad economy.
mm,
Hey, they've shut down the government, and nobody's paying attention to how bad the tariffs are or how bad this other stuff becomes a distraction. So I do think ultimately it was smarter to don't give the Republicans a foil. And Democrats shutting down the government would have given Trump a foil that I think this goes to the Carmel strategy. And I think he's not wrong. It's only been 60 days. The midterm elect we have like 5 life cycles of political mini eras to go before we even get to the campaign season. I've seen some stupid articles written over the last few days about, hey, there's no evidence of a blue wave yet. It's 60 days. We don't even have candidates filing for
yeah.
office. Let's see what the people, ultimately, you know, the economy, people hated the economy and they didn't like the border and they fired the Democrats. If Donald Trump's economy is worse, they're going to fire the Republicans. We're not operating um we're not operating oddly, okay? As a democracy. What is always the biggest driver in voter sentiment? The pocketbook. And ultimately that's still going to be the driver here. And I think now if I were Democrats, the thing I would worry about is what Bernie Sanders said today, which is progressives ought to leave the party. And there is a small part of me, James, and I'm previewing a monologue that I'm going to have on my first podcast in April. But if you examine what happened to the Israeli left, right, when Bibi Netanyahu, the Labor Party, uh, disintegrated. They used to be basically Israel was a two-party system, no different than, with occasional third parties, just like you guys. You guys are essentially a two-party system with occasional third parties that certainly help create coalitions, or you got to shift slightly, but it's mostly two major parties that sort of call the shots. That's the way it worked in Israel for a good 50 years. And then the obsession of not being able to defeat Bibi broke up their coalitions. And that's the only question I have, because in America right now, there's a majority coalition that doesn't want Trumpism. The question is, does that same majority coalition trust the Democrats to lead that coalition? We don't have another party to pick to lead the alternative coalition at the moment. But I think you're going to see some flirting with independent candidacies, because I do think there is a the Democrats do have a major brand problem. It's a staleness. They're the rule people. They're not seem to be builders, right? They definitely do have a brand issue and a culture issue that is something they got to solve. Sometimes a political party's problems are solved by the disintegration of the other side. I give you Keir Starmer
Mm,
as a perfect example.
yes.
Did he succeed or did the Tories implode? I think Liz Truss would give
Largely
us
the
the answer
latter.
on that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yes. And that has largely been the way how Republicans have succeeded
Mm.
over the last decade. They've not won. Democrats have lost, right? And so, and it's possible Democrats will recover simply by not being the Republicans. But I do think you have a growing number of elected officials who want to, if the Democrats can't change the brand on their own, and you really can't change your brand without a leader, without a
Mm.
presidential nominee, without a president. And, you know, this brand is going to be problematic for them until they get a new president or a new leader.
Do you think the Democrats? I mean, if you take the Keir Starmer example, and you're absolutely right, it was largely the implosion of
Hmm.
the Conservatives that led to his rise. But he did reform the party after being led by a very left wing leader in Jeremy Corbyn, similar-ish to Bernie Sanders.
Hmm.
I
Right.
part of what he did was frankly ditch some of the woke stuff, and I wonder if that's what the Democrats just need to do. You know, he moved the party on issues like trans issues, somewhat controversially at the time, but more in line with mainstream British opinion.
Yeah.
On immigration, he toughened up his rhetoric. He respected the fact that people
Hmm.
did want controlled borders. And I wonder if that's frankly what the Democrats need to do. But is there the appetite in the party to do that? Are they comfortable with that?
And that's the real question. So I first got into basically my coming of age in college was right before Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton is essentially played the role of Keir Starmer here. You had the Democratic Party of the 70s and 80s had drifted very left, was seen as a bit stale, focused more on labor, not enough on, and hey, people just wanted a law and order.
Yeah.
So there was a big fight in the party. You had a big fight between Jesse Jackson on the left and Bill Clinton, who started an alternative, wasn't a political party, but it was a big alternative group within the party called the DLC. I have not seen that. We have not seen that divide show itself yet. I think the party actually could use a good public argument. They actually could use, so you basically pick a side, right? It could be a guy like John Fetterman, who is both has progressive credentials, but also has sort of been like tried to grab the common sense lane, if you will. Um, so there are a couple. Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, was the only Democratic governor who never instituted a mask mandate during COVID. Colorado has this libertarian bent to it. So he's a guy that, to me,
Mm.
understands his pop, understands the electorate. John Fetterman was a mayor in the redder parts of Pennsylvania. So he's been careful on this culture stuff. And again, I think he's a guy being a mayor. When you're a governor, you sort of have a better idea. Um, so I think there's no doubt that if the Democrats elect a president in 28, somebody will have done what you and I are talking about. Will have shifted the party to the right, toughened up the rhetoric on borders, a little more law and order, probably a bit of a defense. If you ask me who the ideal resume is, it's probably a veteran,
Mm.
somebody who served, who is going to be seen as more credible on security issues in general, which only will add street cred to being tough on the border and things like that. So, but I don't know who that is. And you know what? It's possible it's going to take our midterm elections to find out who that is.
Just finally, Chuck, talking of 2028, you do get people who say that Donald Trump will find a way or will try to find a way to be on the ballot in 2028. Is that hyperbole or could that happen?
Here's the thing. We've I've used the phrase failure of imagination a few times with you. So I don't want to I you can't ever say never. But our Constitution, it's not implicit, it's explicit. It's two terms. You can't serve as vice president if you're not eligible to serve as president. There is no backdoor way to do
So he
this.
can't
Like
have
some
Donald
people have
Trump
talked,
Jr. at the top of the ticket. He's vice president and he
and be
switches when he
correct, or
can't
it
do
can't
that.
be Vance Trump. No. Now Junior can. Look. I think the most likely Trump on the ballot in 28 is Junior, not Senior. That's one. But and in fact, I have some friends on the right who don't want to see Trump blow up the Constitution like this, who have said we're trying to find different ways to convince people this is a bad idea. And I said, well, here's a good one. I said, why don't you remind them all that if Donald Trump can seek a third term, then so could Barack Obama. And now maybe Obama v. Trump is the cultural showdown that America needs. You know, the ultimate sort of literally yin and yang, right? In yeah, you know, the upside down magnets, if you will. But that's I always joke that that should be the Trump card. No pun
Who
intended.
would win?
You want to run Trump a
Trump versus
third?
Obama.
Uh, it's a great question. I I I think that there is. I wouldn't assume anything. Obama actually has a really good record on the border, so he could run as more of a hey, he wasn't the woke guy. Um, as he puts, look, anybody that can, if you can increase the turnout of African Americans from normal levels up a point or two, it transforms our electorate and it really helps Democrats. So in theory, I think Obama would probably do that. You're going to have to make him the slight favorite. Nobody has gotten a higher percentage this century in a presidential election than Barack Obama.
Well, on that note, Chuck, this has been an absolute pleasure as ever. The Chuck Toddcast returns in April. Thank you so much for
It
joining us
does.
again.
Couple weeks, I promise. Obama v. Trump, that will get people to listen, right? You just make that that'll make the algorithms crazy, right?